Start recording here. All right. So again, two things that I'm trying to do to start off today: explain the fourth quarter, especially the grading aspects of it, and the other part to explain a little bit about the air exam. We are not sure exactly how the air exam is going to affect you all. It may affect you a little. It may affect you none at all. We're not sure because obviously your age group last year you did not take the sophomore air test. So many of you missed out on biology, geometry, your English 2, and your history, uh, tests, if you will. We're not sure how the state is going to look at that in terms of graduation. It's still very early in that process. What we do know is that they do want us to assess you in government, which would have been your last first air test, if you will. It would have been the last first you know, I guess first edition or first you know round of testing for you. Um, you are going to take the air test, but again, I don't know how much it's really going to impact you too much. I think it will end up helping, so it does benefit you to do the best you possibly can on it. Um, but we are going to at least prepare for it to make sure that you're not walking in blind completely. Because again, it's been a while since you've taken one of those exams. So that test date, as it stands right now, is going to be April 15th. Okay, so it's after spring break. What that does for the fourth quarter, anyway, for our purposes here, is you are going to take a air test after spring break. So therefore, we are going to use the next 3 weeks to prep for that air test. We're going to use the 3 weeks prior to spring break to reintroduce a lot of these concepts and make sure that you're aware of kind of what's coming down the pike here when you take the exam. And these are all release test questions. So to put it into simplistic terms here, you notice this week, excuse me, and this week I want to make sure we're all clear. We have switched now since we're going to an A/B schedule for those of you that are in person. And I'm looking forward to actually meeting a few of you for the first time. It'll be nice to kind of put some names to faces. That will happen next week. Because we're going to that, we're now switching over to where we're going to post our assignments on Sunday or Monday morning, and they will be due on Friday. Now, I will say for my sections, at least, what I've been doing is still granting the weekend a little bit to for those that work and for those that really struggle getting assignments in. If you have to kind of spill over into the weekend, that's fine. But if we're spilling over week to week, that's going to be a problem, especially with these diagnostic tests. So starting off the fourth quarter, your first grades for this week deal with, first of all, a diagnostic test assessment, which Mr. Ficker basically went through, took all the released air test questions. So these are real air test questions. He took them and put them into Google Forms and divided them up based upon subject matter. So you have 3 diagnostic quizzes that are very short. None of them are written responses. They are all, check boxes, multiple choice, drop down menus, things like that. They're all just click your answers and move on type assessments, and they're very short. Some of you have actually already done them, so it didn't take you long to get through those. It's just a quick kind of snapshot review, and you have 3. The first one is on the Constitution, second one is on the amendments to the Constitution, and the third one is on the branches of government. So what I'm asking you to do is take the 3 diagnostic quizzes and mark down your scores. So when you turn it in, what is your score on the Constitution? What is your score on the amendments? What is your score on the branches of government test? When you get those done, you're going to mark down your scores and you're going to put them into a survey that is attached as well. That is your actual assignment. Now, instead of me doing the charts that we used to do about what did you learn and what do you still have questions about, where you actually had to type things in, I've made it so much easier for you that there's really no excuse to fall behind on these assignments. The survey that's there literally says, what's the score of your Constitution test? So let's say you scored an 82. You type in 82, and then underneath it, what are the areas of concern? And you would check off maybe terms that you don't remember. I literally have put a checkbox of materials underneath it that you can check off the ones that you're like, you know what, I missed a lot of questions about judicial review. I still don't get it. You can click on that, and you're sending a message to us that, hey, we need to review that one more time. So I need you to go through and do those, that diagnostic test. By doing the 3 diagnostic tests and the survey, you automatically get 50 points for doing what you needed to do. So as long as I go through and see that, yes, you indeed took those quizzes, and yes, you filled out my questionnaire and turned it in, that's an automatic 50 points. And if you get, let's say you get 100% on the amendments, because you know your amendments, you don't have to check anything off. You obviously know them, so move on, so this is way easier than anything else we've done this year. It's literally just click, yep, I did it, and move on. Now, keep in mind, these are not things that I will grade after the air test. So in quarters past here, I've left all of these assignments open all throughout the quarter, and you can always go back and kind of finish them up and, do things that maybe you forgot to do. This will not be the case for this 3 weeks. When you get done with the air test on the 15th, these diagnostic quizzes are all going away. I'm not going to go back and regrade. I'm not going to bother going back. So if you get a 0 on these, it's permanent 0. That's it. So please make sure you take them week to week. You have 3 this week. You'll have 3 next week. You'll have the final 2 in week number 3 right before spring break. So 3 weeks of air prep, and then we go on spring break. When we get back from spring break, we're going to start our financial literacy unit, which that's a project more than anything else. But we go through a number of different things that I'm sure many of you have sat in class and thought to yourself, when am I ever going to use this? You're sitting in math class doing an algebraic equation, and you're like, I'll never use this in my life. Or you're reading a book in English where you're like, this has nothing to do with anything I'm ever going to do in my life. The financial literacy is literally life. It's we're going to do a budget activity where we learn how loans work. We're going to talk about insurance. We're going to talk about taxation. We're going to talk about all manners of things that you're going to confront when you just, in life. You're going to have to learn how to handle these things. So that whole unit takes about 3 to 4 weeks, and you're going to do a family budget. You're going to learn how to kind of balance what you earn with what your expenditures are. So we're going to do that. And then we finish off the year with what is known as the Personal Political Platform Project, which most students actually kind of enjoy. And it's just kind of a culminating activity that takes the place of a final exam. So what should happen here is the final test that you will take in this class, the final assessment that you will take in this class, should be the air test. After that, it's all just effort-based material. So for those of you that are kind of maybe borderline on a grade, or maybe you didn't do all that well during 3rd quarter and need 4th quarter to be really strong to get your credit, 4th quarter is where you should rock it out. That's where you should shine, because it's all effort based. And if you're doing what you need to do, it should be an A. So finishing up the year here, let's make sure that we're doing what we need to do to make sure you get the credit and you can move on to your senior year with your government credit already done, and you don't have to worry about it moving forward. Okay. Obviously, if you have any questions over any of the stuff, you can always reach out. Now, the assignments this week, there are 120 points available in week number 1. So we start your running here. 50 points are the diagnostics. The other 50 is over a civil rights topic called reparations. For those of you that don't know what reparations are, reparations is an argument that basically right now pertains to African Americans. There is an argument out there that says that the United States government needs to, first of all, atone for the sins of the slave trade by doing 2 things. Number 1, they need to officially apologize to the African American community for slavery, which the United States government has never done. Okay, there's no official apology. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation helped to get to that point during the Civil War. And of course, there had been other amendments passed to help ensure the rights of African Americans. There's been civil rights legislation, which we're going to talk about here in a second. But they have never gotten to the point where the United States government has said, "Our bad." And that's again an official statement of kind of apology, if you will. Never has happened. That's the first part. The other part of reparations is making right by the descendants of former slaves. Now, that is where, of course, those that argue this take it multiple ways. Does that mean that the United States government sends checks to people who are descendants of these slaves? Does that mean that we invest in certain government programs that benefit the African-American community specifically? Do we have educational programs? Do we have community programs? Do we, what do we do that could possibly make at least the situation currently of descendants of former slaves to where they're more equitable in American government and American society? So again, that's the big argument. Now, what I've done is I gave you a few video clips that talk about reparations, okay? And I've asked you a couple of journal questions regarding that. So you would merely watch the videos and answer the questions associated, because that's kind of the modern day civil rights argument that we're having right now. And reparations debate happens once every 5 years or so. It's like we yell and scream about it for about 2 or 3 months, and then it just goes away for 5 years, and then it comes right back again. For some reason, we never seem to get anything done on this. We never have a definitive answer one way or the other. So since your generation will probably have the same argument down the road, it's good to know what the arguments are. So that's the second assignment. The third assignment is part of this right here. You literally can bring up on your Google Classroom right now the materials that I'm going over. One of the materials, and I'm going to share the screen here. One of the materials is this material right here, the Civil Rights Air Test Review slide, okay, slideshow. The other one is a set of notes that literally goes step by step through the civil rights. So you right now could bring up the Google Doc that is notes, follow along, type in what you need to, and submit it by the time we get done with the Zoom session, and you're already 20 points ahead. You already have one assignment done, because the diagnostic tests are 50, the civil rights activity over reparations is 50. This right here is 20 points right here. And you're getting extra credit for attending today. So because you're in attendance, if you do these notes, there will be extra credit attached to the activity. So just kind of throwing it out there, or you can just follow along. And then this Google slide is posted as well, so you can bring it up and kind of fill in the right answers as we go along later. Air test review over civil rights. Now, the main things to understand about this is that there are civil rights and there are civil liberties, okay? There's a distinction here. Civil liberties are the freedoms granted to citizens through the Constitution. So these are the things that the Constitution expresses in it that tells you what your rights are, okay? These are the things the government cannot do or take away from a person. Okay, so things the government cannot do to you or take away from you. So you have, without question, so for example, the First Amendment, freedom of speech, the government cannot take that away from you. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, the government cannot take that away from you. You are, basically, it's expressed in the Constitution directly. Therefore, the government cannot limit you or take things away from you because of its expressed liberty in the Constitution. That has nothing to do with civil rights. So your right to own a gun is not a civil right. Your right to, freedom of speech is not a civil right. It is a civil liberty. Okay, and this extends out to every one of the amendments. Okay, the abolition of slavery was a civil liberty, not a civil right. So sometimes these kind of get crossed up and people say it incorrectly. The air test does make distinctions on this. So you do need to understand that if it's expressed in the Constitution directly, it is a civil liberty. A civil rights are legal rights an individual has that protects them from discrimination, but these are outside the Constitution. These are maybe laws that were passed through Congress or Supreme Court cases and decisions. So, and we'll kind of go through them here in a second, but these are things the government must do to ensure equality. So the government actually has to take action on this because it's not expressed in the Constitution is the point, okay? And they're thinking at this point, like workplace discrimination or the right to marry based on your gender. So for example, there is no law, or I'm sorry, there is no statement in the Constitution or amendment in the Constitution about gay marriage. There is none. It does not appear in the Constitution at all. Yet gays have the right to get married because of a Supreme Court case that made it legal. Okay, that's the whole purpose here, that a homosexual's right to get married is a civil right. It is not a civil liberty. Okay, because it's not in the Constitution. It came about because of a law. or I'm sorry, because of a Supreme Court decision. Workplace discrimination is a law. Like, you cannot walk into a workplace and say, I only want a certain race working for me, or I only want a certain gender working for me. You can't discriminate in the workplace. Now, granted, workplace discrimination, again, is not in the Constitution. At no point does equal pay or equal treatment in the workplace appear in the Constitution, but it is a law. So therefore, it is a civil right. And that's just the key distinction that the air test typically draws. Now, what are the civil rights amendments? And this is where it gets crossed up a little bit. The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment were all passed after the Civil War. Now, these are all civil liberties based upon what they are in the Constitution, but all of the civil rights all the civil rights laws stem from these amendments. I know that gets tricky, but that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about here. Is if abolition of slavery is talked about, that is a liberty within the Constitution. That is said by the Constitution. Therefore, the liberty of African Americans is established by the 13th Amendment. It's established by the Constitution, so it's a civil liberty. But if you have any sort of law or any sort of precedent that comes out of that, that is where your civil rights come along. Now, where do the civil rights really germinate mostly from? The 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is probably the busiest of all the amendments, and I'm talking about across the board. The First Amendment's certainly, a very busy amendment. We talked about that when we went through, but the 14th has seen countless numbers of cases in the Supreme Court, all drawn because of the 14th Amendment. And if you remember when I went over Supreme Court cases, and I went over specifically the gay marriage case, the 14th Amendment appeared left and right. I mean, they were all over it. 14th Amendment is huge. Now, why? It's citizenship to former slaves, but in reality, it was blanketing citizenship upon all Americans. And this basically means you cannot take away a person's life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, and everybody has equal protection of the law. So that just basically means if you're an American citizen, regardless of what you look like, regardless of who you are, regardless of your gender, regardless of your religious beliefs, you are all protected equally under the law. You are all given the same due process of the law, which is why the Supreme Court has been involved in all kinds of 14th Amendment cases stemming from racial segregation, stemming from gender inequalities, stemming from mistreatment of gay people, whatever the case may be. 14th Amendment is a very busy amendment. The 15th Amendment is a person's right to vote cannot be taken away on a person's race. So this was allowing African Americans, specifically males at this time, because women don't get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment. But bottom line is, all of these came during the Reconstruction era, right after the Civil War. So these are typically called the Civil War, and sometimes they're called the Civil Rights Amendments. So again, just kind of be mindful of that when the air test brings it up. Now, another one that usually qualifies in the Civil Rights or Civil War Amendments is the 24th Amendment, because it's an extension of both the 14th and 15th, which outlawed poll taxes in national elections. It basically said that if an African American was showing up to vote, in some of these southern states, a poll tax was being used, which was a fee to prevent people from voting in federal elections. They would basically charge them a tax to vote. What the 24th Amendment said is you cannot make a financial hindrance towards voting. You can't say, hey, you got to give me $5, otherwise you can't vote, because voting is your ultimate right as an American citizen. It cannot be denied to you. So by extending the 14th and 15th Amendment, the 24th Amendment made it at least more possible for African Americans to vote, especially in the South. Okay. Now, civil rights acts, okay, these are not civil liberties, these are civil rights acts, are things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is the act that Martin Luther King Jr. was protesting for when he did his March on Washington and gave his I Have a Dream speech. This is the act that Kennedy was working on before he died in late 1963, and Lyndon Baines Johnson finally pushed through Congress and signed into law in 64. This one outlawed segregation in public places, all public places such as parks, courthouses, restaurants, theaters, hotels, and by extension, things like bus services, restrooms, all public places basically were desegregated. This is when and I'm sure many of you remember from, history class or something, seeing pictures where, there were water fountains where it said whites only, and then the other one was labeled colored. This was struck down by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You could not do that anymore, according to that Civil Rights Act. Okay, so it was really just trying to desegregate and get rid of the old Jim Crow laws from the late 1800s and early 1900s. The Voting Rights Act happened the next year in 1965 because they realized that not enough progress had been made through eliminating poll taxes and eliminating other barriers to voting. This basically was equality in state and local elections because, again, the poll tax said you couldn't do it in national elections, but some of these states were like, well, sometimes we have state elections for like mayor or for governor, so we'll charge a tax on those. The Voting Rights Act basically said that the states couldn't do that locally. This has been struck down, by the way. A lot of pieces of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 have since been struck down by the Supreme Court, which is where you get this new version, and this is where the new argument comes in. New argument about poll taxes is voter ID law. You're going to hear a lot about that over the next couple of years because people are concerned about the protection of our elections, and are the people who are voting really the people voting type mentality. So there are a lot of people pushing for what is known as voter ID, where when you show up to vote, you have to actually show your identification, meaning you take out your driver's license or you have some sort of ID card, or in some cases they'll say if you've got a bill that was sent to your address that has your name and your address on it and you've got it, it proves that you are who you say you are. There's a million different ways you can do it, but they're kind of pushing for voter ID laws. Well, on the flip side, as much as most people would say, well, what's the difference? What's the problem? You show up, you show your ID, you vote, no big deal. Well, it is a big deal in some instances because you have, for example, I'll use my recently departed grandfather who was in his late 90s. Before he passed away, I had to take him to get his ID in Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania had passed one of these laws. He was not allowed to vote unless he had an ID, but he had not driven since he was 90 years old. So it had been 6 years since he had driven. So he didn't have a driver's license. There was no reason for him to have an identification card. So I had to take him to the local DMV so he could get an ID card, not a driver's license, just an ID card to vote. And he complained the entire time about how this was a poll tax because he was being taxed in a way. He was right. He was getting taxed to vote. He had to pay money to vote. So this is going to be the next round of argumentation, especially in front of the Supreme Court, are these ID laws in violation of not only the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but possibly the 24th Amendment as well, okay? Now, it outlawed literacy tests. It provided federal oversight in elections, and basically got rid of a lot of what are known as the grandfather clauses that said if your grandfather voted, then you get to avoid all of these hindrances. Well, of course, who were the grandfathers that were voting? It was white people in the South that had grandfathers that could vote. None of the black people had grandfathers that could vote because their grandfathers were slaves. So this was their way of kind of getting around the Voting Rights Act of 1965, or I'm sorry, around the 15th Amendment that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 kind of eliminated. And it finally got black citizens the ability to participate in state and local elections, which has been growing ever since. And if you want to see kind of the culmination of it recently, it was the flipping of Georgia from being a Republican to a Democratic state in the most recent election. Joe Biden winning Georgia, that had not happened for quite some time where a Democrat did that well in Georgia. So, and I don't know if you know who Stacey Abrams is, but Stacey Abrams is from Georgia. She was a governor candidate for the governorship a few years back and had lost a very close election. As soon as she lost that election, she immediately started working on registering African-American voters, getting the voter turnout up in Georgia, and her efforts basically allowed for Biden and Harris to take over the White House. So there are a lot of people especially the Democratic Party that have been trying to rescue the Voting Rights Act, because without the Voting Rights Act, Stacey Abrams would not have been as successful as she was. Okay. The other one on here is the Fair Housing Act. In 1968, they prohibited discrimination in regards to the sale, purchase, or rental of a home based on a person's race, religion, or national origin. So this basically was the idea that you could not, as a housing owner or as a landlord, you can't invite people in to take a tour of, let's say, an apartment complex, but then decide not to rent to them based upon the fact that, oh, well, I don't rent to Jewish people, or I don't rent to African Americans, or I don't want to rent to gay people. Like, if you do that, you're in violation of the Fair Housing Act. So these are, again, acts of Congress that extended civil rights. And as we talked about, the court cases, Brown versus the Board of Education, the big one that ended segregation in schools in 1954, this ruled that segregation in public schools violated equal protection under the 14th Amendment, and overturned Plessy versus Ferguson that had said separate but equal was okay. So Brown versus the Board of Education is, of course, the landmark decision that really kind of spurred the modern day civil rights movement. But you have other court cases that would qualify as well. We just went over one a few weeks ago when I talked about Obergefell v. Hodges, which was the gay marriage case. That would also be another one that was fought over the 14th Amendment and equal protection under the law for gay people. African Americans were equal protection under the law under Brown versus the Board of Education. And then, of course, there's all manner of cases that happen based upon poverty levels, based upon race, religion, ethnicity, whatever, that have all gone through the Supreme Court. Anytime the Supreme Court makes a decision that the government is denying somebody their rights based upon the 14th Amendment, you have what is known as a civil rights court case at that point. So that's kind of the basic overview of the difference between civil liberties and civil rights in regards to at least what you need to know for the air test for government. Again, this week, you have some diagnostic tests to take. You have some assignments to work on. If you have questions, obviously reach out and ask through email. You can certainly do that on our online sessions on Wednesdays. And for some of you, you'll be in person on A and B days. And just a reminder, Fifth Bell would be on a B day. So some of you I will see next Tuesday. Just so you know, my room number is 240. So it's on the top floor of Northwest High School in the back, right next to the back staircase in the back hallway here. So again, I'm looking forward to seeing a few of you in person. I know I've seen a few of you that are in Mr. Johnson's cohort, because I like coming by to mess with him, and certainly to meet some of you. But for the rest of you, if you're remote, obviously we'll still have Wednesdays. I'm not going to be doing anything, curricular, if you will, on Tuesdays and Fridays when I see you in person, but we will have discussions. Feel free to bring some questions with you, about anything we've covered or anything we haven't covered, because, government should also be a talk about the issues and, things that concern you about the country. And one thing you're going to learn about me is when we're in class, nothing is off limits. You're allowed to ask whatever you want. There's no topic that I'm scared to talk about or, scared to bring up. So bottom line is, feel free and comfortable to come in with questions, concerns, anything. And again, if I see you in person, great. If you're remote and still want to participate, obviously we'll still have Wednesday sessions where we can talk about whatever you want. You can email me and say, hey, on the next Wednesday session, can you explain what's going on with this? Or can you talk a little bit about this issue? Because as we go through the fourth quarter, it's going to be nothing but issues and, conversation about what it's like to be an adult, if you will. So again, I encourage you to kind of participate however you see fit. And again, I'm looking forward to seeing many of you in person starting next week. If you have any questions, feel free to stay after. Otherwise, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you down the road. Have a great day. Enjoy the weather.